Part 2, Annotating Complex Texts, the QUIP system. What is annotation? We talked about this a little bit in Part 1, but here we're going to really focus on the process of annotation, which, as I mentioned before, is a process of active reading. What it involves is making legible marks on a target text while reading it for several reasons. And here are the purposes of annotation. First of all, it is to facilitate understanding at the present moment. It's to allow you to make marks on the text to sort of direct your eye, direct your brain to what seems to be most important in the passage that you're reading. Secondly, it allows us to identify particularly interesting or particularly problematic passages to return to for further study. Anything that you think is not exhausted by your first reading, something that you think it seems particularly important or particularly puzzling, or just stands out in any way, you should mark it. You should highlight it or underline it, depending on what mode you're in, so that you can come back to it later without having to go through the entire text. And you can just go to the passages that you know are going to require significant additional attention. Third, annotation allows you to interact with the ideas presented in the text. And traditionally in a paper version, this would take place in the margin, right? You would write questions, you would write ideas of summaries, and you can do the same thing with the digital text, and we'll talk about how you do that. But it's the key thing is that you are doing something, right? You are writing something even as you're reading, even if it's just a few words here and there that will be important when you go back. It also these marginal annotations could be where you connect with your own ideas, right? Maybe something that the author is saying leads you to think about something that you've thought about before, or that you're just thinking about at that moment. Or maybe it connects with something else that you read in this class or elsewhere. Or it connects with a previous experience that you may have had. Finally, overall, what we're trying to do is to help you to develop possible responses that you might become, for example, one of your essays in this course, or one of the informal writing assignments that we're also going to do. So, students don't always annotate. That may seem amazing, but they don't. What are some of the reasons that they don't? And sometimes they're good reasons, right? Some texts don't need to be annotated. If you're just reading for pleasure, or it's a very simple text, I don't annotate when I'm reading a novel for pleasure. I do if I'm going to teach it. I do if I'm going to write about it. I don't annotate when I'm reading the daily news, usually. Although sometimes I will save something if I think it's particularly interesting. But I don't annotate everything. But when you're reading something seriously, right, when you're going to have to write about it, when you're going to have to really understand it at a detailed level, you really need to read actively, and the best way to read actively is to annotate. It's to, either literally or figuratively, to have that writing implement in your hand so that you can interact with that text as you're going along. So the not so good reasons for not annotating. One is students are not convinced that reading is important in a writing course. They think they can just skip over that step and go directly to writing. And we've already discussed that in part 1 of this series. And all I can say is that they will quickly realize, I think, that their writing is not what it should be if they're not also reading and reading actively. Sometimes the students don't annotate because they're reading on a phone or on a tablet, and they're unsure how to annotate digitally. And this is a valid concern, but we're going to talk about that in parts 3 and 4. We're going to look very closely at how do you do that. And the third reason they don't annotate is they don't know how, right? They've never really been taught a system for annotation, and that is our topic here, is to introduce a system for annotation. It is a system, it's not the system, but I think that it has the elements that any good annotating to have. And I call it the QUIP system, Q-U-I-P, because there are 4 types of comments here. Q is for questioning, that is, comments that ask about specific words, terms, allusions, or references that allows you to engage in dialogue with the text. A lot of times, especially in these complex texts, there will be vocabulary words you don't understand, or there will be technical terms that you don't understand. I mean, we're going to be reading something, for example, from anthropology, and they may be talking about something technical there that you don't necessarily understand, or they may be alluding to some famous work of literature that is not famous to you, and so you need to identify that as something to be looked up later. I mean, of course, not all of these things need to be looked up, but the ones that are interfering with your understanding of the text do have to be looked at later. U is for understanding, that is, comments that paraphrase or summarize. You should keep a running topic list for making reverse outline. So you're writing in the margin sort of a few words about each paragraph so that you have a sense of, okay, this is how it develops. And if you go back to make a reverse outline, which is, a lot of times you make an outline of something that you're going to write. A reverse outline is something you do while reading about something that's already been written, and you try to figure out what the structure of that is. And it's also a way of doing what I call meaning checks. That is, you're writing you're writing something down that helps you to say, okay, did I really understand that paragraph? Let me write down in a few words what I think it's about. That's a good way of doing that. So, interacting. I comments are comments that respond to the text using the reader's inner voice. That is, connection to your own ideas, connection to previous reading, or to personal experiences. And finally, passages. And this is probably the most frequent thing you're going to be doing. You're going to be marking textual passages that are useful for later study. And I talked about this already a little bit. You're going to highlight them, and ideally you're also going to say something about them, although not always. Sometimes you just want to keep moving along, you just want to mark it and say, I'll come back to that later. Although sometimes you'll mark it and you say, oh, I know why I'm marking that, and then and if you do, it's probably worth taking a moment to make a notation to go along with it. But as I say, sometimes you want to just continue. But this is probably the most frequent type of marking that you're going to make is and how do I decide which passages to highlight? Well, here are some possible reasons. And I mean, the basic reason is anything that strikes you for any reason, and it just sticks out in your mind. Sometimes you don't even know exactly why you're reading, but basically anything that you pause over while you're reading is a candidate. Why might you pause? Well, because it's a particularly interesting idea, because the passage might just have memorable, powerful language that just all of a sudden something becomes really clear because of the way that it's written, because of the way that it's explained, because of the way that the author has chosen the words that are in that passage. On the other hand, some passages may seem to be important, perhaps because they're in an important structural place in the essay, at the beginning, for example, at the beginning or the end of a section, but you're not quite sure exactly why they're important, and or they might not be immediately fully understandable, mark them, and come back later and say, okay, this seems important, but I didn't get it quite at the beginning, but I want to just keep going, so I'm just going to mark it and I'm going to move on. The other thing is that as you're reading, you should be looking for patterns of repetition as they develop. Authors will repeat ideas, they'll repeat words, they'll repeat even sounds. That there might be a system of illusions that is building up. Any kind of pattern that you see is going to help you to understand how that text is constructed. So, and as we mentioned, anything that is um, and so that leads us to questioning, to Q comments. Comments that ask about specific words, terms, allusions, ways of engaging in dialogue with the text. If you don't understand the key terms used in the text, you won't understand the text as a whole. So mark anything you don't immediately recognize. You don't need to know every last reference, only those that interfere with your understanding, but you should probably mark them, and then you can decide whether to go back and decide, should I look this one up? Is it worth the trouble? Of course, with Mr. Google, it's not as much trouble as it used to be to go find out, what is that Greek myth that is being referred to. It really won't take that long, and it often does add to your understanding of the text, because the author expects you to understand it. If they don't explain it in the text, they expect their reader to understand it. And of course, that tells you something about who they think of as their audience. Now, sometimes you'll find that these things are glossed for you. If you're reading in a textbook, there may be footnotes, there may be explanations in the introduction. And so, make sure that you read the notes or the intro and see whether their explanation helps you to understand the text better. If there are no glosses, then you're going to have to do it yourself. But as I said, that is now a lot easier. Annotations, understanding, are attempts at summary or paraphrase of particular paragraphs, particular sentences, or particular sections, or the whole text, right? So you can do this when you're scanning the whole thing. You're trying to get a sense of what are the pieces of this, what are the parts of it, or it can be as you're going along, paragraph by paragraph, or even when the going really gets tough, sentence by sentence, or even word by word. Meaning checks, articulating what you think the author is saying, trying to predict where the argument is going, and then you can look back and see whether you were right. See if you can, if you're reading the signals correctly that the author is giving you about where they're going. This is useful because it allows you to keep a running list of topics for a future reverse outline of the text. It'll allow you to say, okay, I can create a document that will allow me to see how this complex text is constructed, and oftentimes that will give you additional insights into the meaning or the meanings of that. And finally, the fourth kind of annotation is the I type, where you're interacting with the text, allowing you to make connections to your own ideas, your previous reading experiences, your personal experiences, any kind of connection that comes to mind. It allows you to respond to the text or to any part of it, to agree, disagree, to identify implicit or explicit assumptions that are made in the text, to record your own emotional reactions as you read, right? So anything that strikes a chord with you, anything that interacts with your own experience or your own previous reading, write that down, because that's going to be the basis of writing assignments and just of a richer kind of interaction with a text that goes beyond just sort of decoding it and understanding it, but that allows you to make an actual connection between it and yourself, the things that you think, the things that you know, the things that you feel, the things that you have experienced, the person. So, um, we call the system QUIP. Does that mean you have to question, then understand, then interact, then mark passages? Not at all. I mean, I just talked about them in a completely different order than that. Um, so they can be and usually will be done in any order as you're reading a text. And it's certainly not the case that you go through and you do all the questioning and then you go through and do the understanding. No, you're going to be mixing and matching. You're going to use each of these when appropriate. You're going to move from one to the other. Probably P will be the most frequent. As I said, you should highlight anytime you have the slightest impulse to do so, even if you don't know why. U should be done systematically. Think of it as leaving a trail of breadcrumbs so that you can trace your progressive understanding and create that reverse outline going later on. So that one you're going to have to sort of force yourself to do, and maybe that's on the second reading, right? Or maybe you'll do some of it on the first time, but then on the second time through, you're just really trying to figure out how all these pieces go together. Questioning will depend on the text. Some may have many terms that are new to you, others will have none at all. Some may be pre-glossed for you by the textbook editors, some not at all. But in most texts, there are going to be some things that you're going to need to question. And I is really the most important level because it's where you are most individually involved. It's also where you lay the groundwork for your later writing project. So anytime that you feel anything toward that text where it strikes any kind of a chord, you should make sure that you do interact with it, that you do annotate it at that point with an annotation. And so should you indicate which kind of annotation you're using? And the answer for purposes of this class is yes. Please do begin each comment with a letter indicating its category under this system. For example, if it's an understanding annotation, use a U colon, right? You should do this in both the individual annotation your first time through and in the group annotation. Keep track that you're using at least some of all four categories in each text you read. And as I said, it doesn't have to be equal, right? There's probably going to be more